U.S. Modernist Radio is part of DesignNetwork.org, exclusive architecture and design podcasts reaching creative listeners worldwide.
Hi, I'm Stacey Kent, and you can catch me at stacykent.com, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Every industry has insiders, and no city, other than perhaps New York, attracts more attention from residential architecture than Los Angeles. Joining us today is James McClain, co-founder and editor-at-large of Dirt.com, which tracks significant celebrity houses. Later on, we've got music from legendary jazz musician Dave Brubeck and his son, Darius Brubeck. And now, a guy who tracks significant architectural houses, your host, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. There's a long line of TV shows exploring enduring mysteries. We've all seen them. They're on the search for Bigfoot, or UFOs in New Mexico, or Amelia Earhart, or the Loch Ness Monster, or Treasures of the Knights Templar, or any number of fascinating stories that tap our imaginations. The first show I remember was Kolchak, the Night Stalker, which was a fictional thing with Darren McGavin. But the next documentary after that was In Search Of, narrated by Leonard Nimoy.
I remember that.
Now there's Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates and a battalion of other shows running around the world, interviewing often the same people. My favorite one-off of these was Geraldo Rivera, opening what was allegedly Al Capone's vault, only to find nothing. The show In Search Of, sadly, never found anything either. And as informative and entertaining as he is, Josh Gates hasn't found anything. None of the shows, as far as I can tell, have reached the treasure or being or person or answer they ultimately sought. It's a tough business, this mystery hunting. It's why our research team here at U.S. Modernist likes a rousing hunt for significant and mid-century houses. Although it takes some work, they are really a lot easier to find than, say, Bigfoot. Sometimes all we have is a photo, or a partial address, or a past owner with a common name like Anne Brown. Like another genre of TV, the cold case shows, we've closed hundreds of missing house cases. It's incredibly fun and important work. You can't preserve modernism if you don't know where it is and why it's important. One of our volunteers, Catherine Kramer, wrote me 10 years ago and just can't seem to stop looking for houses. She's found thousands of them and solved many of those harder missing cases. If you see a house on our website, usmodernist.org, for which we're missing its history, please be in touch. You can write me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In the Atlantic Ocean near Boston, a fishing boat rescues a raft containing a woman in a red cocktail dress, a DeWalt toolkit, and an old iPhone 4, still working but wiped clean. The woman has no memory of who she is, but the ship's doctor finds a tattoo on her ankle with the address of an In-N-Out burger and the words triple-double animal-style Dostoevsky. When the ship docks, she drives cross-country to Thousand Palms just outside sunny Palm Springs, California. Relying on her undergraduate degree in Russian literature, she knew, like we all do at some level, that Fyodor Dostoevsky's profound examinations of the human soul would be the key to finding the most satisfying burger on the secret menu. To her shock, the In-N-Out burger is closed, but she grabs her trusty heavy-duty DeWalt drill and breaks in. Steel doors fall down behind her. Unusual for an In-N-Out, but hey, it's our story. Then the iPhone rings. Someone says,
"Hello, Angela Roll."
Will she escape to one day rent scooters on Mykonos? Tune in next time for more of The Roll Identity. Meanwhile, memory restored, modernist realtor Angela Roll specializes in modernist houses, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to whether Pushkin or Chekhov would win a rap battle. Reach her at angelaroll.com, that's ROEHL, or 919-995-0550. Oh, no worries. That In-N-Out Burger in Thousand Palms is still very much open.
Thank you, Tom. I was worried there for a moment.
Sorry.
Our guest, James McClain, grew up in L.A. and studied at USC's Marshall School of Business. He worked for one of the biggest firms in L.A. real estate by day, not as an agent, but as the finance guy. However, by night, James was already a wildly popular real estate blogger with a secret identity. Yolanda Yakety-Yak, the real estate yenta, self-described as a kind and gentle lass who would love nothing more than to pet flowers and sniff puppies all day. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Yolanda's Little Black Book reported details behind some of LA's most high-profile transactions and scooped everyone for years. The site attracted over 300,000 hits a month. Yolanda has since retired, but James is still going strong as co-founder and editor-at-large at Dirt.com, which checks into the massive and often clandestine transactions of high-profile houses and people in L.A. He's still the Lady Whistledown of celebrity real estate. That's a Bridgerton reference for those of you non-streaming fans. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love the intro.
We're glad to have you with us. When did you start the blog with Yolanda?
The blog was started in early 2016. So although it doesn't feel like it, it's been over 5 years now that I've been doing whatever it is I do here.
You've just been getting the scoop on, who buys what or who sells what.
Right.
And we should tell our listeners that, since all this happened, and he's going to tell the story here in just a moment, you've turned this blog into a full-time job.
I have, yeah. It all sort of just happened naturally. And, it's something that I've kind of always been interested in is just houses and the people that own them. And so it kind of all started around college age. And that's how I, figured out how to look into records and these transactions. And then, I just got the urge to start writing about them. And writing is something that I never saw as a career option. But then I guess, like many things in life, it was just one of those happy little accidents, I guess you could say. And it just sort of happened.
Now, how did you choose your secret identity, Yolanda Yakety-Yak?
So I thought it would be a little boring if it was just this random guy writing about real estate. At the time I was working in finance, and I just thought it would be a little more interesting if I put some more flavor on it. And actually, the co-founder of Dirt.com, where I write today, his name is Mark, and before my blog existed, he had his own blog called The Real Stalker, which was very, very popular back in the day as well. And over time, I became a very big fan of that blog while I was in college. And so I would begin doing my own research and sending him tips along the way. And he would have names for all his informants that he would give them, and he would use them in his blog and just give them cutesy little names. And he gave me the Yolanda Yakety-Yak name. And I just thought it was the funniest thing. So I decided to use that for my own when I eventually ventured into writing on my own.
So this is like witness protection, where the government gives you like a passport, a driver's license, and a new secret identity in a house in Arizona?
It's always in Arizona or New Mexico.
Like
right.
Now, Mark was your mama, right?
Mark was your mama. You've done your research. Yes, Mark was your mama. And he really is the one who deserves the credit for kind of, starting this whole train that we're on, because he had his blog, which eventually morphed into Dirt, which was a subsection of Variety, and was a part of the weekly Variety magazine for many, many years. And then once I joined, Dirt became its own brand under, the same corporate umbrella as Variety, but spun off to become its own separate real estate transactional reporting, I guess you could call it.
So Mark had the Real Stalker column, and he was your mama. And
correct.
And he referenced your alter ego, Yolanda, I think nearly 300 times.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I would not doubt that at all.
I mean, you were a key informant. You were like, the government star witness.
Correct. I was a key informant, especially towards the end, for probably 2013 to 2016 is when I really started getting into it before, launching my own thing.
Now, at the time, was this before you started working for the real estate firm when you started the blog?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, yes. I started the blog in early 2016, January 2016, and I began working for the real estate firm in end of 2016, like October, November.
And you weren't an agent, so what does a finance guy do inside a real estate firm?
Basically, what a finance guy does is make sure agents get paid.
Okay.
So when an agent gets a closing, we would have a system of how, they're getting their checks from escrow, but we need to make sure that the escrow breaks down the commission check correctly so that the brokerage gets the amount it's supposed to and the agent gets the amount he or she is supposed to. And also, just reconciling the P&L statement for each office. So basically making sure that offices are staying within their allotted expense range, that they aren't ordering an oversupply of, 100 Cokes when they should be only getting 10. So basically, I was the money guy, making sure, everyone was getting what they're supposed to.
Okay, fascinating.
Yeah. So back office kind of operations.
Exactly. But it was also very interesting because you got to interact with all these big personalities and salespeople, but, especially real estate agents. They're very interesting to work with because they all have their own personality and they all have their own kind of method of how they find clients and get deals and stuff like that. So I found that pretty interesting too.
So while you're making sure everybody gets paid correctly, Yolanda is starting to grow in popularity.
Correct. So Yolanda was rapidly growing in popularity during that time.
What were some of the most fun stories that you broke?
Something about a big celebrity buying a house that I personally find interesting. Like, for example, Ellen DeGeneres, just a great one that comes off the top of my head because she is pretty much she's the biggest architecture enthusiast in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah. She's bought several modernist houses.
Yes, several, including one of my personal favorites, the A. Quincy Jones house in Holmby Hills that she owned for a short period. I forget the name of the house, but it's just a really cool property built in 1950 by A. Quincy Jones, and Billy Haynes did the interiors.
Beautiful house.
It was just absolutely stunning. And she flipped it probably 6 months after she purchased it for $10 million more than she paid to one of the co-founders or the former president of Facebook, who apparently just had to have the house. But
wow.
Anything, I love modernist homes. That's my favorite architectural style, mid-century modern. So
well done, James. And thank you for pandering to our audience.
We're giving you kudos. Now, Ellen, last year, Ellen DeGeneres' show was mostly being shot from her house, or so it seemed. Was that one of these fabulous homes, or was that all a set?
I think that was mostly a set.
Okay.
Yeah.
Us rubes were fooled.
They got one in on you there.
Actually, I want to say she bought a place in Santa Barbara. They bought an estate from Dennis Miller in Santa Barbara because it included a Tom Kundig barn, very avant-garde barn building. So it might have been down there.
Okay.
That they have more room to do a production kind of facility on that place.
That place has about 5 different structures on the estate. So she's got plenty of room there to set up her own studio or so for all I know, it could have been filmed there. That's a very good point. I thought and I sort of assumed it was a set, but I could have been fooled myself.
Now, as Yolanda was growing in popularity, who knew that was you?
Not many people, to be honest with you. I made it a point to kind of keep Yolanda,
yeah.
and not reveal my true identity to anyone. So it was very much a sort of a hush-hush secret. Although, when certain people would reach out and would say, we have a lot of people were interested in kind of business opportunities. For example, I had a couple people reach out who were, I guess you could call them estate managers, and they wanted to sort of grow their audience of people they could market to. So they would reach out and say, hey, can we meet up? And I think there's a way we could, work together because you seem to know everything about everyone, and we'd love to, be able to market to these people in some way. So occasionally I would, talk on the phone with this or that person, but mainly Yolanda was just, Yolanda, and I liked it that way. It was fun.
There were some outrageous theories in the real estate world about Yolanda's identity, right?
Right. I think a lot of people thought that it was either, more than one person, or that it was someone high up at one of the brokerages, or someone that, like, there's no way that one person could know all this, information or have time to do all this research or something. I think along the lines of how it went.
And were the real estate agents bothered by it?
I would say that they more generally enjoyed publicity.
Yeah.
In fact, at the beginning, I wasn't crediting agents. I would write about a house that had sold, and I wouldn't include the agents' names in it. And then I just, over time, as Yolanda began to grow in popularity, they would start to reach out and say, hey, can you give me credit as the seller's agent or the buyer's agent or something on the story? So I decided to begin including that. And also it was kind of, I noticed on a lot of the other sites that I was reading that it was sort of industry standard. So I began reaching out to them. And then occasionally, of course, there would be some too that were like, oh, who gave you this information? Where did you get it? How did you know that such and such person bought this house? So there was a little bit of that too, especially towards the end as Yolanda was getting bigger and bigger.
So at some point, the venerable LA Times decided to spend some considerable resources investigating you.
Right.
That was in 2018. What precipitated all that, do you think?
I love the LA Times. They're great. One particular reporter was a little bit, I think, annoyed that I kept scooping them. So there was a little bit of a friendly competition there. And also, a lot of people as Yolanda was getting bigger, a lot of people in the real estate world were just getting more and more curious about who Yolanda was. And as it really started to get more popular, probably in like 2017, 2018, I was just scooping everyone. And I probably scooped too many people for my own good.
Now, would the LA Times have considered hiring you as an investigative real estate reporter?
I think they should have 100%.
Yeah.
But I never got a formal offer, unfortunately.
Well, eventually, Variety and Penske did just that. Correct.
Yes. Actually, even before the whole LA Times did a little expose on Yolanda, but even before that, in the months preceding that, Mark, who I had known, previously through his blog, and he was working for Penske Media at that time for Variety. And so they had made a couple overtures to me, to Yolanda at that time, to join as well as exactly that, as a sort of investigative journalist. But I had kind of, I liked doing my own thing. I didn't really see this as a full-time career. So they had made a couple overtures to me previously, and I had said no. And then shortly after the whole LA Times expose happened, and as it happened a few months before that, I had left Compass. I was starting to focus exclusively on the blog, and I was making decent money, but they just said, come into the office and let's just have a chat. And so I did that, and I did that a couple more times, and it just ended up working out. And before I knew it, I was at Variety myself, which is somewhere I never expected to be. And now I'm at dirt.com.
One of the things that everybody loved about Yolanda was her voice and her point of view, which was a little snarky. How did you come up with that? Were you just naturally snarky, or did you have to go to the actor's studio and pull some snark from your past?
I definitely enjoyed the point of view of the real stalker, which was also a little snarky.
Oh, yeah. And your mama was very snarky.
Your mama was probably snarkier than Yolanda, to be honest, especially in the beginning. And then once your mama joined Variety, the stories just weren't as snarky anymore. And I understood why. It was a more professional setting, and I think it was just a little bit tired of the super snarky voice. After a while, it starts to kind of, ring in your ears. It gets a little tiresome. So I kind of missed it on my own, though. So when I started with a really snarky voice, and I already had a little bit of snark in me, but I also amped it up a little bit because I thought it would attract more attention, and it did, which kind of helped the blog grow to be what it was. And then once I joined Variety, I really toned down the snark, though, because to be frank, I was a little bit tired of it, because at that point it had become such a heightened thing. It was more than my, I guess, internal snark level. So it was constantly having to find ways to make stories more snarky. And at the end of it, I was just, I've done this for 3 years, and it's become a little bit, I recognize that people loved it, but it just became a little bit too much for me. So I decided to tone it down.
It takes a lot of energy to write in that kind of voice, really.
It does. It does. And I think, I think not everyone understands that. So when I joined Variety, I got a lot of messages from Yolanda fans that said, we missed Yolanda. We wish Yolanda was still writing the way that she did. But it was, like you said, it was just so much energy. And I'm just really happy with the way. I recognize it probably wasn't the best decision for everyone who's a fan, but for me, it was the best decision to kind of tone back my writing a little bit.
Well, James, as we move on here, our research team has actually found a song about Yolanda. Now, it's difficult to find any song about Yolanda, but even more difficult to find one we can get the rights to on short notice. So for the next 1 minute and 16 seconds, here's a tribute to Yolanda.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
Yolanda, Yolanda, Yolanda. Yolanda, Yolanda, Yolanda. 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 Yolanda, 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 Yolanda. Yolanda, 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 Yolanda.
You can find just about anything on the internet.
That was pretty incredible, George. I don't know if Yolanda's ever been flattered quite that way.
The lyrics are so meaningful. I could pick them apart for hours.
I know. There's a lot of inner poetry there. So, James, let's talk about how the donuts are made here. People aren't aware of the scope of property information that's available in public records. What's out there?
Anything, a grant deed is public record. Mortgage documents are public record. So, it's not just about, you'll say you're a celebrity looking to keep your name off records, which they all do nowadays. But it's not, there's a little more to it than that, because grant deeds have addresses on them that can also be tracked, as do mortgage documents. LLCs, you can look up an LLC on the California Corporation website and find out who the members are, who the managers are, what their addresses are. Mortgage documents often require, even if the property is held in a trust, that the settler of the trust signs the mortgage documents too. So it's a little difficult for anyone high profile to keep their transactions under wraps, especially when you're dealing with someone very wealthy who probably has a lot of people working for them, and people talk. And in LA, people love to talk. So that's great for my business.
I imagine if there's a house in a neighborhood, and let's say it's worth $13 million, which is probably a starter home in some of these neighborhoods.
Right.
You've got dozens, if not hundreds, of tradespeople going in and out of that house. and the neighbors and things like that they're talking too, right?
Constantly. I mean, some of these houses, they're like their own business because there's just every single day, there's like cars lined up in the driveway outside of just tradespeople at the house going inside and out. And then, of course, if someone moves into your neighborhood, the whole neighborhood is going to know. If you can buy a house and keep it under wraps, but you can't really live in a house and keep it under wraps because people are going to know and people are going to find out. So it's a little bit of a fool's errand for some of these bigger stars to hope that their transactions stay under wraps.
So when you see Ellen DeGeneres pulling up in her driveway, you kind of know.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Or her moving van.
Yeah.
Or her moving van, or her moving team, or her design team.
Now, James, what's your unicorn? What houses or owners are you still searching for that are eluding you?
I have a whole list, but I'll tell you the biggest one, though, is the manor in Holmby Hills. That huge, huge house. I think it's the largest house in Los Angeles. It was built by Candy Spelling and Aaron Spelling back in the 1980s. It's got about, I think it's larger than the White House, something like 56,000 square feet, or it's close to the size of the White House.
Oh, yeah, I know that. I know that house. It's enormous.
Yeah, it's enormous. It's probably visible from space. But it was Candy Spelling, after Aaron Spelling's death, Candy Spelling famously sold it to Petra Ecclestone, who at the time was 22, the heiress to Formula One. And then Ecclestone sold it in 2019 for about $120 million to an anonymous buyer who apparently never even came to visit the house in person before he bought it.
No, I wouldn't. You know, 120 million, sight unseen.
Yeah.
Where's my checkbook? Yeah. The rich are different from you and me.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different universe out there.
Is this, let's see, 111 North Mapleton Drive?
Oh, George, have you been searching?
It's on Mapleton. It is on Mapleton.
We have that in our archives. That is designed originally by Paul Williams, the famous architect. It was sold, and Williams did kitchen alterations in 1962. It was featured in the LA Times on November 11th, 62. It was sold to the Mankiewiczes, who I believe are related to the Mank fellow in the movies, won the awards recently.
Herman Mankiewicz?
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, we have a little info on this on our site, James.
Oh, wow. I'll have to check that out.
There you go.
Probably doesn't tell you who's owning it now.
But the history is very important for my stories, too, because I love to include that little bit of flavor there, too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. This was originally the Joseph M. and Eleanor Harris House in Los Angeles.
So you have a database on all these notable properties in L.A. as well, and elsewhere, I'm sure.
We have 5,000 houses in L.A. approximately, James.
This is sort of what got George started in this.
I don't have a colorful character named Yolanda yet, but maybe I'll get one. I'm thinking about it. I'm going to work on that for next week.
You can always adopt one.
Is there another unicorn you're still hunting for?
Let me pull up my list right here. Rupert Murdoch's son. I don't know if you know Chartwell in Bel Air, the Chartwell estate.
Is that the Beverly Hillbillies estate?
Yes, it is.
Oh, yes. I know that one quite well. Designed by Sumner Spalding.
Back in, I can't even remember the year, but I'm sure you have it. The house was modified, or at least expanded in later years.
Yes. The Lynn Atkinson and Bernice Stevens house, 750 Bel Air Road.
Oh, wow. Yes, 750 Bel Air Road. And then I don't recall exactly when he acquired it, but Jerry Parenchio, who was the billionaire owner of Univision at one time, he acquired the estate, and he subsequently acquired probably about 5 or 6 neighboring properties that he either raised and turned them into gardens, or that he acquired the houses and then used them as staff housing or guest housing or what have you, or garages maybe. And so the estate grew in size probably during the 1990s to become just an enormous property, one of the biggest in Los Angeles.
In 2018, it was the most expensive house in the United States.
Right. That year, 2018, sometime around then, it was sold for $150 million to Rupert Murdoch's son, Lachlan. And then after that, he sold his former home in Brentwood for about $20 million. And I haven't been able to figure out who bought his house, but I do think it's a celebrity.
Okay, well,
so that one's on my list as well.
For those of you that don't remember this, The Beverly Hillbillies was a 1960s sitcom about an Appalachian family that found oil on their property, made a lot of money, and moved to Beverly Hills. And it was a kind of takeoff on, these rednecks in the big city. I think it was on for at least 5 or 6 years with Irene Ryan and Buddy Ebsen.
Yep, it was a huge hit.
Huge hit. And
Right.
They filmed primarily on a soundstage. They filmed a lot of the exteriors at Chartwell, which has this very luscious, ornate pool that Granny on the show used to call the cement pond.
That's right.
I always found it a little bit funny that the house is not actually located in Beverly Hills, but that's sort of typical for Hollywood.
Yeah. Everything can be made up, right?
Right.
Well, Beverly Hillbillies was just too easy a name to come up with. It's smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, exactly. Bel Air Billies or what have you probably doesn't work quite as well.
Right. So Lachlan Murdoch, he's the boss now at News Corp.
And Fox.
Yeah.
The whole shebang.
He kind of had a little falling out with his dad.
Correct.
We don't need to go there.
Well,
right?
his dad married Jerry Hall, Mick Jagger's ex-wife.
Oh, that's
Right.
right.
I mean, he is like super busy on a beach somewhere with Jerry Hall. I don't blame him. It's like, here,
But
son.
you're right about the falling out, because at one time he was on the outs, and it looked like his younger brother was actually going to be the one to take over the business, but I guess that shifted.
Yeah.
Both of you might be interested that his younger brother, James, also moved to L.A. some years ago, and he ended up buying his father's estate above Beverly Hills. And it was, 1330 Angelo Drive.
1330.
Wallace Neff.
Wallace Neff, sure.
Oh.
Yeah, we don't have Neff in our archive yet. He's on our to-do list.
This house in particular I found kind of interesting because it's actually shaped sort of like got kind of like a pie shape to it almost.
Yeah.
Or I guess like a half moon sort of shape, crescent shape.
It's called Misty Mountain.
Right.
Designed by Wallace Neff and built in 1926 for film director Fred Niblo and his wife Enid Bennett. It has its own entry in Wikipedia.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, James, last question before we let you go. What's going on with that huge piece of untouched, unspoiled land up in the Hollywood Hills, the largest open acreage in L.A.?
Are you referring to the mountaintop?
Yeah.
So here, I'll give you the little backstory. Back in the 90s, it was acquired by the founder of Herbalife, Mark Hughes. And he passed away, I think, in the late 90s of an overdose, apparently, at his Malibu home.
Not of his own product, I assume.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I can't confirm or deny that.
Okay.
His only heir was his son, who at that time I think was maybe 6 years old, something like that.
Oh.
And the property was put into a trust for his son. He had originally planned to build just an enormous estate on the property, probably one of the biggest estates in the U.S., if not the world. That obviously never came to fruition, but the property was put in a trust for his son. One of the trustees was his grandfather, apparently. Years and years of legal battles followed between the son and his mother and the trustees of the trust that owned the property. And the son accused the trustees of financial mismanagement. They apparently got into some sort of agreement with a shady developer / con man that gave him partial ownership of the property. And a few years ago, this con man was renting out this huge, vast tract of undeveloped land to be used for parties and stuff like that. And the consensus is that he was sort of using this land to gain attention from wealthy foreign investors to sort of present himself as this huge mogul to get more money for himself, basically.
Okay.
And eventually the property was foreclosed recently or was sold at auction, and it was ultimately purchased by or repurchased or went back into control of the son, who is now an adult. But it took a very long time for that to happen, and there were a lot of the property was graded at one point, and there was, going to be a huge community of large mansions built there. That never came to fruition either. And in fact, I'm not entirely sure what's happening with the property at this point.
Well, this is 157 acres. I mean, this is an enormous.
It's an enormous tract of land. It's really the only large tract of land anywhere near this scale left in LA, if not SoCal.
And according to the LA Times, it was once owned by an Iranian princess, Merv Griffin, and the nutrition mogul you mentioned earlier. So it's passed through several hands. Correct.
And I think, it was just, I wonder if it would just ended up being more than any of these people thought that they had bargained for. They just didn't know what quite they were getting themselves into, because it's just such a massive tract of land that developing it, I couldn't even fathom the cost of attempting to develop something like that, whether it would be for one estate or for several estates on, speculation. It would just be an enormous amount of money just to get, utilities up there and to get everything graded and approved by the city and the neighbors down the street to allow for a whole driveway to be put up there. It would just be a nightmare.
Well, James, I know that when something happens, we can read about it with you at dirt.com.
That's true. You definitely can.
Thanks so much for joining us. This has been fun.
Thank you, George and Tom. I appreciate it.
If you don't know the name Dave Brubeck in the world of jazz, you haven't been paying attention. And if you don't know the name Beverly David Thorne in the world of architecture, well, you're about to learn more. These brilliant gentlemen came together more than once to create two amazing modernist houses, one on the West Coast and one on the East.
Dave Brubeck grew up in a ranch family and was going to be a veterinarian when observant professors wisely steered him to the music department. In the World War II Army, he created one of the U.S. military's first racially integrated bands, the Wolfpack, and Brubeck stood up for his guys. He canceled several concerts and TV shows when owners objected to an integrated music band. In 1959, the Dave Brubeck Quartet recorded Time Out, which featured the monster hit Take 5, making it the first jazz album to sell more than 1 million copies. From there, everybody knew Dave Brubeck.
At the age of 9, architect Beverly David Thorne designed his first house near Auburn, California, and helped his grandfather build it. I guess at 9 you needed some help.
Yeah.
Thorne designed Dave and Iola Brubeck an Oakland house in 1954 that catapulted the architect into national fame. Ed Sullivan even did a show featuring the Brubeck Quartet at the house. But Thorne did not adjust well to the notoriety, and eventually he dropped out with an unlisted phone number, although he designed another house for Dave and Iola in 1963, this time in Wilton, Connecticut. He was also part of the famous Case Study House series. In the 1980s, he resurfaced and practiced primarily from Hawaii until he passed away in 2017.
We are thrilled to have on the show Dave's son Darius, who grew up in these houses. Darius studied ethnomusicology and the history of religion at Wesleyan University. And upon graduation, he performed with his dad and his brothers. And in 1983, he moved with wife Catherine to South Africa, where they founded the Center for Jazz and Popular Music at the University of KwaZulu-Natal until 2005. Now they are in the UK, and Darius leads the London-based Darius Brubeck Quartet. Welcome, Darius.
Oh, it's good to be here. And I love talking about the houses I grew up in, so let's just get right to it.
Okay. Before we get started, though, how are you feeling? I heard you had COVID and were in the ICU last year.
Big time. I was intubated. I now have a new vocabulary. I was on a ventilator for 25 days.
Oh, my
I was
goodness.
in the hospital for 37 days.
Oh, no.
When I went in, they kindly informed me, and I'm not saying this ironically, that I had a 50-50 chance, and I just came out on the right end of that equation. I knew there was something to fight for, and I did my best, but it's all down to the NHS, the National Health Service in England. They saved my life.
People love the NHS in London, don't they?
Yeah, they do. It's chronically underfunded, so of course there are issues about waiting for operations and things. But when it's a real emergency, I went in an ambulance. I was really on my way out, and they kept me together, and here I am. I've got gigs booked for this summer as soon as lockdown comes off.
That's good. The 50-50 worked out.
Yeah.
Hey, Darius, what do you remember about that first house in Oakland? Were you there the night Ed Sullivan came in?
I must have been. Where else would I have been? But I don't remember a lot about that because the kids we were supposed to stay in our rooms and not get in the way of the crew. What I really remember was just the joy of the ever-changing views from that altitude, which, okay, we're not talking about a Rocky Mountain peak, but we were above the fog level.
Uh-huh.
So when we had a clear view, we could see the Golden Gate and the San Francisco Bay Bridge and all of the lights of Oakland and some of Berkeley in between and over to San Francisco. And when it was foggy, it was like we were in some kind of magical dimension floating above the clouds, because if we looked straight out, we were still seeing stars, we were still seeing the moon, planes passing, and just cloud below us.
How did your mom and dad meet up with Dave Thorne? Do you know?
I think he was a fan.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there was any other kind of connection through Mills College or anything like that. I think he just came to gigs. And as the whole premise, bearing out the whole premise of your blog, there was something about that kind of mid-century modern aesthetic or mindset, maybe something broader than aesthetic, where people like my parents and Dave Thorne and artists who were working at that time in different fields kind of were felt drawn together, where there was that great post-war period.
In reading the accounts about Ed Sullivan coming there, I mean, this house just fascinated people. They thought it was just the world's most wildly futuristic house. This was what living was going to be like for everybody one day.
I was surprised to see on your website how many similar houses there were. It was the only house of that kind that I had ever seen. And I think that style is so strong that my opinion is that it would almost NorCal mod or mid-century modern is accurate in terms of periodization, but I think I would call it classic or American classic, because looking at the photographs you have up on your website, they don't look like old structures, or they don't look out of style. They just look different. And it's the marriage of geometry, materials, site, predominance of cantilevers, which was a way of making as much level square footage as you needed, whatever the site was like, and adapting to nature.
Now, Thorne did a second house for your parents in Wilton. Why did they move to the East Coast?
Well, that's pretty simple. In 1954, Dave was on the cover of Time magazine, which made him suddenly, not that he hadn't been working hard up to that time to get around with his quartet. That was a complete change to being an international celebrity from just being a jazz musician who, like many others, was respected and working a sort of circuit. And moving to the East Coast was kind of the move, which he was reluctant to do because he just had this great house built. It was a result of signing with Columbia Records, which was CBS. It was kind of a big step up from anything that was attainable in California at the time in the music world. And it also made him accessible, much more accessible to his family because he was away from home so much. Living in Oakland, California, when he was on the East Coast, he could do a European tour and still come back home and tour colleges and auditoriums in all the big cities in the Northeast and come back home. Whereas in the old days, if you had to go all the way, say he had a concert in Detroit, it didn't make sense to come all the way back to Oakland for 5 days and then go to New York and go from there to England, come back home and then go do a concert in Germany. But once we were on the East Coast, we saw a lot more of it, and that's what he wanted.
Tell us about this first song, Kathy's Waltz.
This was written for the Time Out album, and the inspiration for it was my sister, Kathy. And Columbia Records initially spelled Kathy with a K. So in revenge, she started spelling Columbia with a K. And what you're going to hear, by the way, is not from the Time Out album that you know. It's a new release from Brubeck Editions. That's our family label. It's a new release, but it's not a reissue. This is from the same 1959 recording session, but this was a never previously released take of Kathy's Waltz, now with the correct spelling.
Darius, your dad was one of the first cultural diplomats, part of something called the Jazz Ambassadors. What was all that about?
Oh, that's kind of a long story. There is a PBS and BBC jointly made film about it called The Jazz Ambassadors that people may want to watch. But the answer is that this was during the Cold War, and I had the privilege of going with my parents in 1958 on a tour that went behind the Iron Curtain. And younger listeners may not know what that means, but that was within the Soviet sphere of influence. We went to Poland. And then if you drew lines on a world map that showed the Soviet Union as was, it basically went around the Soviet Union from Poland to Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Ceylon.
Okay, so surrounding the Soviet Union, but aside from Poland, I guess not truly behind the Iron Curtain.
No, that was all they could get permission to do, but it was very important to the Polish people. And the Jazz Ambassadors program was actually amazingly enlightened. This was during the Eisenhower era, and Adam Clayton Powell actually sponsored the idea of sending jazz musicians out on the road to demonstrate America's cultural uniqueness and achievement. There was no use competing with the Russians in terms of ballet, for example, but things that were uniquely American got a lot of attention in those days. One was jazz, another was abstract expressionist art. And the other thing is that the Russians were, unsurprisingly, and perhaps justifiably, using racial disharmony, racism, in other words, as a cudgel to beat us with. And by sending out the Dave Brubeck Quartet with a black bass player, and they also sponsored Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie actually went before Dave. They were sending a different message. The America I still believe in, but until recently seemed to be on the retreat. Maybe a kind of vulnerable message to be sending out in the post-Trump era. But I still think it speaks for many of us, and perhaps even most of us, as the last election proved. And Dave fervently believed in democracy, fervently opposed racism. Both Dave and I actually actively participated in the civil rights movement back in the day.
And you've been a cultural ambassador, too, working in South Africa and Turkey and Romania. What's that all like?
Well, those were all different things. Turkey and Romania were Fulbright, which is, again, a great American program from that era, actually. Senator Fulbright created the Fulbright Commission that sponsored primarily European students to come to the U.S., but the exchange wasn't more U.S. students. It was more people who were advanced experts in various fields. So as well as being a jazz musician, they might have been an expert in vaccinating cattle or something. But the idea was to send people to other academic institutions in Romania and Turkey, in my case, that asked for it. So they asked the Fulbright Commission, do you have a jazz guy? And my name was on a list, and I had the honor of serving in that capacity. South Africa was a different story altogether. That was the main period of my adult life, really. I was there for 23 years as an academic. And for my South African wife, it was a way to go back home and make a difference and to encourage change. And I think we succeeded at that. We founded the Center for Jazz and Popular Music. We started jazz education, which is now available in every South African university or tertiary institution that I know of that has a music department, and spearheaded the integration of Black African majority students into university well before democracy finally arrived in 1994.
This next song, Darius, we're going to get to hear you perform, and it's a song called Kathy's Summer. How is this a sequel to Kathy's Waltz?
Well, my wife's name is Kathy, also with a C. It's not really, it's not really a sequel, but I guess it provides a sort of through line. Anyway, this is my UK band, the very group I'm going to go out and tour with this summer, since I didn't die.
Which we're happy about.
That's a good reason to have a tour.
Yeah.
Here's Darius with Kathy's Summer. Darius, that was delightful. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Where can people find you and your music? Is there a website?
Well, there's DariusBrubeck.com.
Okay.
Otherwise, if they're just looking for the music and not my website, it's available on all of the digital platforms. You can get it on Amazon. The record label is Ubuntu Records in my case. Brubeck Editions, which is the family label, is a different story, but you can get that on Amazon too. Or look at davebrubeck.com.
My last question. Did any of these modernist houses have any influence on subsequent places you've lived? Did you ever live in a modernist house yourself and as an adult?
No. The nearest to that was in Camden Town in central London. For a while, we had a marvelous apartment that was, you've heard of Gilby's Gin, right?
Yes.
Okay, well, Gilby House used to be the gin factory, and they were converted into great flats. So we had a flat directly overlooking the canal. People familiar with London would know this is a really iconic location right at Camden Lock, where the famous market is and where there's a lot of young people, artistic activity. And we had a floor-to-ceiling window, not actually a cantilever because it was directly part of the structure, but it reminded me of the Hartwood Drive house because there was one wall that was just glass looking out into the activity of Camden Town and the canal boats going up and down and the kids partying. And it was really a nice place to live. Then we decided, Kathy and I decided, well, we better grow up and move to the country. But it was a great era living there.
Well, Darius, thanks for joining us. I loved it.
Oh, thank you. See you, George. And thanks, Tom, too.
Thanks for listening. The music of Dave Brubeck provided by Derry Music Company, and the music of Darius Brubeck provided by Gathering Forces Music and Valentine Music. The Yolanda song is courtesy of Matt Farley of Moturn Music. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin, and by Modernist Realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 8,000 significant modernist houses, and access 3.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino researches guests while juggling a number of above-average children, a laptop, and George's car keys. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Mysterious Women Bloggers in Real Estate edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Yolanda.